and the way we feel, and feelings being both emotions and physical body sensations. And also there's a relationship with behaviours. And historically, people have really thought more, when we think of CBT, we often think about the relationship between cognition and feelings. And we sort of, the focus has often been on trying to change cognition. So we use disputing or reframing to change the way we feel. But often behaviours have been neglected as a means for change. So here's the typical thought monitoring form or reframing form, where you sort of write down the trigger, the thoughts, the feelings, click on the reasoning errors or select the reasoning errors, and then you sort of try and do some reframing, re-rating strengths of your beliefs, now positive actions. So this is one part of CBT and still can be very, very useful. However, what we call logical disputing, there are some problems with it. And I'm sure all of us who use CBT will at times say, look, I get these clients who will say to me, I understand it, I know the logical response, but I just don't feel it. It just doesn't feel real to me. And the beauty of behavioural experiments is that they actually provide experiential learning. You actually change your behaviour, do something differently, and you learn through that experience that, that the way you were thinking perhaps is not accurate or not reasonable. There is a very strong relationship between cognition and behaviours, and I think behaviours are highly perhaps neglected aspects of our functioning. Our behaviours tell us everything about who we are, how we think, and even demonstrate our historical core beliefs. So the way that you behave today, whether you review these, tonight's session, or whether you just go and put your feet up and have a relaxing time, the way you interact with other people, whether you reach out and call somebody or whether you don't, the way you perceive the COVID and the way you respond to COVID restrictions, all of those things are strongly affected by cognition. And just having a look at some examples of that, if your cognition is this task is loathsome, and I'm sure many of us have certain things that we think that way about, it has a behavioural consequence. And of course, the behavioural consequence is we tend to ignore it. If your cognition is that person is a jerk, it affects our behaviours. And if you think about it, how does it affect your behaviour? Well, you tend to be, tend to be very standoffish and ignore that person. If your cognition is that they won't like me, think about how that affects the way you behave, and if that is your belief. And with clients who have that belief, how does that affect their behaviour? And if, on the other hand, their cognition or your cognition is they will love me, you operate with an assumption that you're lovable and a worthwhile person, how does that affect your behaviour? And the interesting thing, of course, is that not only does it affect your behaviour, but when you behave in a way that's consistent with that belief, it reinforces the cognition. Because, of course, when you feel comfortable with who you are, you behave in a way that reinforces to other people that you're a worthwhile person. Other beliefs is, well, even if we take the example, I'm at high risk of getting COVID-19, if that is your belief, how does that influence the way you behave? And when we look at our clients, how does that belief influence our clients' behaviours? And of course, if that is their belief, they tend to be much more cautious, much more avoidant. Perhaps at the extreme end, they, in some cases, are afraid of leaving the home or go to all sorts of extreme lengths with safety behaviours. And again, the behaviour is just reflecting cognitions. And if the belief is people untrustworthy, of course, that affects people's willingness to self-disclose, to be honest, to, I guess, to trust in all sorts of ways. It may even lead to conspiracy theories in some situations and anti-vaxxer type behaviour. If your belief is, I'm not capable of achieving anything I want, another example of cognition, then obviously that has an effect on behaviours as well. So I guess just to sum up, the way that we think has a really powerful effect on the way that we behave. And sometimes as therapists, we don't pay enough attention to behaviours as a possible mediator for changing cognitions. The problem with beliefs is that they're self-reinforcing, and we know that people behave in ways that repeatedly reinforce their own beliefs. And the problem is, if you, for example, believe that you're not lovable or you're not worthy or you're defective, and you consistently behave in ways that are consistent with those beliefs, so you don't reach out to people, you don't smile, you don't take social risks, you don't communicate in a way that signals to people that you believe you're a worthwhile person, you never get the opportunity to discover that your beliefs are not correct. So this is where we start looking at behavioural experiments, and we know that behavioural experiments are among the most powerful methods for achieving cognitive change. In studies of therapists, they were rated as producing greater cognitive change than automatic thought records, and in a couple of studies that's been a consistent finding. And my experience is talking to various people that they're very widely used, but not always effectively used. And sometimes we just, throw a behavioural experiment out at the end of a session and say, why don't you try and do this? And sometimes we even forget to follow up the results, or if we follow up the results briefly and the client says, no, I didn't do that, we don't sort of pursue it any further. And the secret with behavioural experiments is plan it well, make sure the client is aware of it. Sometimes it's following up with during the week before the next session, and making sure that the client actually participates in the homework. So there's two parts to a behavioural experiment. The first part is actually setting up the experiment, and the second part is in the follow-up, the following session, and that's discussing the results and discussing the conclusions. What did you learn from doing this experiment? And again, just to separate, because I think for a lot of people there's kind of confusion. When people think of cognitive behaviour therapy, they think of the behavioural component as just exposure. So I want to just very quickly differentiate between behavioural experiments and what we mean by exposure therapy. Exposure therapy actually derives from Skinner's behavioural therapy. And the basic philosophy behind exposure therapy is if you keep repeating the same behaviour, you can possibly do it in a graded way, but it's prolonged exposure to a feared stimulus. Eventually the anxiety subsides. So the secret with exposure is habituation is the key. And I'm just we see that in animals as well as humans. Our next door neighbour's got a dog about a month ago, and it was barking all the time and sort of driving me mad. And interestingly, over time, you may hear him now, he barks occasionally, but over time he's barking less and less. And what he's doing, what's happening there is habituation. He was just a puppy, he's getting used to the new environment, he's less distressed. They're able to leave him at home on his own more frequently now without him becoming distressed. So that's just an example of habituation that happens with exposure therapy. When we're dealing with exposure therapy with clients, it's usually getting them to do the same thing over and over again. And I've just got an example of an exposure schedule. So this is when we're just doing pure exposure therapy. This is actually for someone who had a car accident and was very nervous about driving again. So we start with very simple tasks like driving around the block. We get the client to record the date, how long they did it for, and how much anxiety they felt. And then gradually over time the anxiety drops, ideally if it all works well, and then you extend the exposure to going further, longer, during more busy times. That's classic exposure therapy. Behavioural experiments are a little different to that. It's a cognitive strategy, and we use it when we recognise that the client has biased negative beliefs. And usually we can actually recognise that these beliefs are distorted, but at the same time, the client believes that their view is correct. So behavioural experiments are a way of testing the validity of their beliefs. So this is where you can sometimes, we often might try and use logical disputing, but logical disputing may not always convince them that they're wrong. They need that experiential learning to discover that the way that they're thinking is wrong. And what we're looking for is an expectancy violation. In other words, when what we expect doesn't happen, and you have that big aha moment, and you sort of suddenly realise, you know what, I was wrong, maybe I'm wrong. That's when we start to get the cognitive shifts. In the earlier days, we used to call it disconfirmation. So some of the early jargon was disconfirmation, which is basically the same thing, that when the client's expectations aren't met, when they do an experiment, there is learning. Learning takes place. And then they can do it a few more times with different versions of the experiment to gradually get really solid cognitive shifts. So we need to identify and discuss the beliefs first. Sometimes it's useful to look at the origins of the belief. So a client who believes that they're defective, or that they're, that they're unlovable, or people don't like them, you might actually talk about where that belief comes from, and it can be sometimes an attachment issue, and you may talk a little bit about the importance of healthy attachment, or it may be that they were bullied as children, and or as sometimes in high school, and some of those experiences have had scarring effects. So the client still believes that they're not okay because they're still very affected by the origins. And I think it's useful to actually see, for the client to understand where that belief comes from. And then when we're working through behavioural experiments, to recognise that it's just a belief. Just because you believe it doesn't mean it's true. Sometimes it's useful to also look at an alternative, more balanced view. One of my favourite ways of getting people to realise that this may just be thoughts is the theory 1, theory 2 method. And those of you who have done my CBT for generalised anxiety disorder will remember that we talked about CBT. We do some of the training for looking at theory 1, theory 2. Which is just saying something to the effect of, okay, so one possibility, theory 1 is you go with the client's belief. Theory 1 is, okay, maybe you really are very defective, and we've got to find ways of making you less defective. We say that sometimes lightly if we're talking about defectiveness. Theory 2 is, this is just a thinking problem, or this is just a belief, and it's a belief that you've acquired as a result of some of these experiences that we've talked about. By the way, if you haven't done my generalised anxiety disorder workshop using CBT, I am giving it again this Saturday via webinar. So you can contact PDP Seminars or Carmen if you're interested in doing that. So the question is, we spend a little bit of time talking about the origins of the belief, suggest alternative theories. Maybe you're right, maybe you're wrong. How can we test whether your beliefs are true? So for anxiety, and in fact, with anxiety, a lot of the work that I do is behavioural experiments, because a lot of the beliefs are so fixed that behavioural experiments are one of the more effective ways of getting them to open up those beliefs. Usually with anxiety, there is a belief that something that they're doing is protective, some sort of safety behaviours protect me. So and releasing my safety behaviours will result in something bad happening. So, for example, if I self-disclose to others, people will think I'm defective and lose respect for me. I just had a client on Friday. I see quite a few people with dizziness, and one of my clients is really worried about people finding out about his dizziness, and he said, if people find out I'm dizzy, they'll think badly of me. They'll think I'm defective. So we did a behavioural experiment, and I got him to to tell some of the people that he knows that he suffers from dizziness from time to time, and of course there was nobody thought anything other than poor guy, it must be hard. So it just opened up that sort of conversation and reduced feelings of shame and fear. If I don't check my symptoms every day, I will miss an important sign of illness. This is for people with health anxiety. Getting people to, to recognise that the things that they're doing to try and make themselves safe become part of the problem, and checking symptoms, even though it feels like it's helpful, actually has the opposite effect. And overthinking and overanalyzing prevents bad things from happening. So, of course, people with generalized anxiety disorder do a lot of overthinking, overanalyzing, thinking, strategizing, overly planning for things, analyzing interpersonal situations, etc. And it's a way of trying to make themselves safe, and it feels like it helps to some extent. So once again, we use behavioural experiments as a way of testing what happens if you stop doing some of the analysing. And again, in the GAD workshop, I talk about specific techniques that you can use to temporarily stop the worrying and overanalyzing and seeing whether your beliefs are correct. Another example where behavioural experiments are really handy is for social dynamics. So, for example, if I reach out to so-and-so, there will be negative consequences. Yeah, this is where if you've got clients who are very reluctant to initiate social connection, they're not big connectors, and particularly in COVID, that may be a real issue because they're feeling a bit isolated, and you're trying to encourage them to make contact with people. And there's often this belief that if I reach out or if I make contact, they won't want to speak to me, or they'll be annoyed, or it'll be awkward, or I'll be rejected. And of course, when you're setting up the experiment, if there is a high risk, or from their previous history or what they've told you that there's a high risk that they will be rejected, then obviously that may not be a good experiment to start off with or do at all. But if they describe these people as friends and people that they do hang out with from time to time, then just encouraging that client to be more socially proactive, getting out there, making the connection, taking those social risks, is really helpful, and can also be a form of behavioural experiment. The other one that people often have fears and problems about is if I'm nice to that person, and it might be a colleague at work, or it might be a mother-in-law, or it might be the neighbour down the street, or someone that they have a acrimonious or unpleasant relationship with. And I always try to encourage people to, don't let that other person determine how you behave. You're allowed to be pleasant, and why don't you just do it as a behavioural experiment? Be pleasant, say hello, ask how was your weekend, doesn't matter. And the fear is, if I am nice, they will think I'm weak, they will take advantage of me, something terrible will happen. And when we sort of put it as a no-lose experiment, you can stop being nice to them after a week. Let's just do this as an experiment. We often find really interesting outcomes. And if we get a chance, I'll talk about that a little bit more further down the track. And of course, the other types of cognition that really respond well to behavioural experiments are perfectionists. And perfectionists are usually very, very fixed in their cognition, very kind of reluctant to release their perfectionist behaviour. And often it's about self-esteem and a fear that somehow if I stop being perfectionist, if I stop being perfect and getting perfect results, then somehow I'll be not a worthwhile person, or negative consequences will follow. So typically things like if I lower my standard, I'll become lazy and unmotivated, or my work will be sloppy, or people will lose respect for me, or I will be a failure. And all of those can be tested by via behavioural experiments. Okay, so let's just pause for a moment, and we'll do poll 3. And what I'm interested in is, for those of you who do set up behavioural experiments, how much preparation do you spend on preparing your client? So can everybody see that poll in front of them? When prescribing behavioural experiments, how much preparation do you do with your client? Lots of preparation, a little bit of preparation, And the last one might be you just tell the client to just do the experiment. Okay, so it's interesting. So we've got about 17% who would say really no preparation. I think that's probably very typical. Should we share the results? Yep. I think very typically, I think there's a lot of people who really just suggest it, and sometimes suggest it as an afterthought. And majority of people say, look, I do a little bit of preparation, and some people say I do lots of preparation with the behavioural experiment, and perhaps that includes using a form, because I'm going to suggest that we use a form. And I believe Carmen has emailed you the two key behavioural experiment forms that I'm going to talk about today. And in fact, I'm going to talk about mainly one of them, but I'll make reference to the other. So what I strongly recommend is recording the experiment. And there are two main formats. I'm going to be mainly talking about the format that was promoted in the Oxford, I have the book here we go. It's called The Oxford Guide to Behavioural Experiments in Cognitive Therapy. This is their suggested format with slight modifications, and I think it's terrific. But there is a simpler version which I'll talk about briefly as well, which you can do, especially when you're doing repeated experiments and they're pretty simple. You don't necessarily need to use all of the components. So two reasons why we record the experiment. First of all, when you formalise the task, you get better compliance. You sit down with the client, you give them the form, you get them to start filling it in. You're more likely to get them to actually go away and do it. The second thing is that when they bring back the form, and I will even sometimes email them to remind them that they need to do the experiment, and please don't forget to bring the form back to the next session. And when you actually review it and you go through what they've done, it actually consolidates the learning. You get a much better level of learning when you actually go through this formal process than when you just suggest doing something and perhaps briefly just review it the next day. And the behavioural experiment form, you've actually got it, I think, in PDF format. But these are the components. You've got the belief, the client's belief, an alternative perspective, the experiment, the specific predictions. If my belief is true, what would I expect when I do that experiment? And then finally, the results and the conclusions. In cognitive behaviour therapy, when we're talking about behavioural experiments, we always say operationalize the outcomes. And what that actually means is be specific with what you expect, or with what the client expects will happen. Don't just say, I'll make a fool of myself, or people will think I'm stupid. Because how do you know that? What specific evidence will you have to know that people think you're stupid? For example, it needs to be observable and objective. For example, not I will look silly, but maybe people will laugh, they might roll their eyes, they'll groan. So you need to have some evidence. If you're decided that you look silly, you need to have some evidence beyond I just feel silly. Or not I'll be anxious, because when you're doing it for anxiety, it sort of goes without saying that you probably feel anxious. But what is the feared outcome that you feel that makes you feel anxious? And it might be, people will be looking at me, people will think I have no friends if it's a social environment. Or it might be that I'll be so anxious that I'll feel overwhelmed and I won't be able to speak in my presentation. So you still need some sort of catastrophic outcomes. Not enough for the client to just say, I'll feel anxious. And I'm going to share with you a couple of recent clients that I had, and of course names and identifying information have been changed. But the first one is a young woman in her late 20s, a people pleaser, very socially anxious, really fearful of negative evaluation, complete lack of sense of entitlement, always trying very hard to make other people I guess, like her, and she's overly agreeable, and she very rarely self-discloses beyond the superficial. So, her whole, all of her behaviour is geared towards not being judged harshly. So here's the behavioural experiment that we set up. And so the first line of the experiment form was, if I self-disclose personal information or reveal any negative thoughts or emotions, people will dislike me. Now, in the alternative perspective, you, the therapist, I always get the client to write this down with the form in their hand, but you, the therapist, actually suggest the alternative perspective. And I always say, well, I just make it in the negative. So if I self-disclose personal information or reveal any negative thoughts or emotions, people will like me just as much. And in this case, I said, or even more. I don't always say that, but in the case of when you believe the behaviour that the client is engaging in is actually paradoxically having the opposite effect, you can even suggest that there may be some beneficial effect when the client drops the safety behaviour. So here's the experiment. So we designed the experiment together. You might ask the client, how can you discover whether your belief is true? And in this particular case, the client suggests, next time I'm involved in a social interaction, I'm going to disclose something personal or honestly reveal my thoughts and feelings, including thoughts that are negative or feelings that are unpleasant, because that was the other thing. She never wanted to say anything negative, and she never wanted to say anything like, I feel anxious or I feel uncomfortable, or reveal anything that might disclose anything sort of negative about her. So here were the specific predictions are the client's specific predictions. What does she believe will happen if she does this experiment based on the belief? So you always go back to the belief. What do you think will happen? And the client said they'll give me disapproving looks, they'll look agitated or bored, they'll change the subject, they'll try to get off the phone sooner if I'm on the phone, they will reduce the frequency of contact, they'll be reluctant to talk or do things with me in the future. So these were some of the things that she feared, and these were all from the client if she sort of changed her behaviour. And then the results, so when we set up these experiments, these first 4 parts we do in session. It's up to the client then to go away and to do the experiment and to bring the form back next week. Now, the client can actually start filling in the results, or they can fill the results in with you in session. And you say, what were the results? And she said, well, I had 3 conversations that were more honest than usual. There was no negative feedback. It felt good. I felt more connected. And then finally, the conclusion is, what did you learn? What did you learn from this experiment? And in this case, she said, I can self-disclose and reveal negative thoughts and feelings without being rejected. Disclosure can lead to positive outcomes. Okay, so that's a simple kind of conclusion. And of course, at some stage, we're going to try and encourage her to do more of that, to consolidate the learning and to demonstrate that it wasn't just just a few little examples. It's actually something that consistently happens when she changes her behaviour. Very quickly, this is another client, and this is one of those situations where the client's sort of fearful of upsetting emotions, and quite a lot of people tend to sort of avoid negative emotions because they're fearful of being overwhelmed. And this was someone who had to sell her sanctuary in the Blue Mountains, and the sanctuary was a place that she would go for peace and tranquility. And because of COVID and loss of income and sort of changes in the family business situation, they had to sell the property. And she actually was so distressed. And I talked about mindful acceptance of grief and opening up to it. And she was very reluctant, and she was worried about being overwhelmed by emotions. And her comments were, I feel like I have to control these emotions. If I allow myself to experience them fully, I'll just be overwhelmed, and sort of it feels like I won't recover. So we designed a behavioural experiment, and the belief If I allow myself to experience these upsetting emotions, they'll overwhelm me, I won't recover. And the alternative perspective, which is what I suggested, is if I allow myself to experience these upsetting emotions, they'll resolve by themselves. So here's just the alternative suggestion. The experiment is actually go for a walk, while she's there, go for a walk in the bush and allow myself to be present with my feelings without trying to control them, without trying to stop them. Try to feel it as fully as I can. Whatever it is that you're feeling, try to feel it more or as fully as you can. And the specific predictions were based on her belief at the time, these feelings will overtake every aspect of my life. I will not be able to stop crying. I will have a breakdown. And the results were, when she came back and I asked her what happened, she said, look, I felt sad, but not overwhelmed by sadness. After about half an hour, the feelings passed. I felt strangely peaceful. And the conclusions that she wrote on the basis of our discussion was, allowing myself to feel sad does not lead to catastrophic escalation. My sadness resolves over time. I guess one of the things that many people learn from practicing mindful acceptance is that upsetting feelings come, but they also pass. And very quickly, this is just another example of one of my clients who does all online tutorials. She's at uni, but it's all online now. And she was afraid of asking a question because she thought the tutor and students would think she was dumb. And I said, the alternative perspective, how about if I ask questions during online tutorials, the teacher and the students, will not think I'm dumb. And the experiment was to ask questions in class when she's not sure or she needs clarification on something. And the predictions are, and again, you can see how we've operationalized the predictions, the outcomes. Teacher will make patronizing comments. And these are sort of things that people imagine when they're fearful, that she'll make patronizing comments like, well, if you had done the reading, or she'll back the question back to me is, what do you think the answer is? And students will groan or make disapproving remarks. So the results, she asked, again, she went away and did it. She asked several questions. No one groaned, no one commented. The teacher answered the questions, and it also just then meant that other students started asking more questions as well. So what did you learn from that experience? Well, asking questions in class does not cause people to think badly of me. You can sort of describe the conclusions in all sorts of ways, but that's a simple conclusion. She may say, asking questions in class does not necessarily cause negative feelings. There's other ways that you can conceptualize that. Okay, now, before we go into our breakout rooms, I want to remind you that you have received handout material for discussion in the breakout rooms. And there are two cases. One is Monica, who is terrified of anything to do with death and won't talk about it, think about it, look at anything that reminds her of death for fear that she'd just be overwhelmed and can't cope. And the second example is Irene. And Irene is constantly self-flagellating, can't practice self-compassion, constantly blaming herself for not doing enough. And I'm going to invite you to set up behavioural experiments. You've got some space on those handouts. There's a couple of other examples using the other form there as well, just for your reference, but we won't be actually referring them in today's session. So Carmen, when you're ready, we're going to make it, I think, about 10 minutes. So Carmen, when you're ready, if you could put people into breakout rooms, and I invite everybody to make the most of that 10 minutes.
Thanks, Sarah. We're going to create the breakout rooms now. If I could ask you to all click join, and when you get into your room, ensure that you are unmuted and that your camera is on so that you can see each other to get the best experience. Thank you. I'm opening the rooms now. Okay, I'm going to mute myself again, Sarah, but I'm still here.
Okay.
Okay.
did notice, I noticed there was a question while you guys were in the breakout room. I noticed a question that said, well, what if the experiment fails? And I'm actually going to talk about that after the breakout rooms. That's the last thing I want to cover. First of all, any feedback, any comments that people from the breakout room? So you had 2 examples. I did in the breakout room that I very briefly attended discover that not everybody received the handouts for discussion. I guess it's a bit hard to get feedback from you guys because there's such a big number. But if you didn't, Carmen's just resent the handouts, which are a bit late for the breakout rooms, but at least you've got the material there, and you might still have a go at going through it. So in the first example, we have Monica, who has extreme death phobia. Hopefully those of you who did fill out the question, the behavioural experiment form, wrote something to the effect of, in her belief is, if I'm forced to think about death, I'll have a breakdown. And the alternative perspective is, if I'm forced to think about death, I will not have a breakdown. Or you might say something to the effect of, I will cope. And the experiment, well, some of us are already doing these sort of behavioural experiments, but perhaps in a less formalised way, getting your client to read about it, to talk about it. You may start a death discussion in your session. You may get your client to close their eyes and talk about the experience of death, what it will be like to be dead, to fast forward 10 years after they've died. What will the experience be? Just confronting some of those things that seem too scary. They might start streaming programs like 6 Feet Under or other shows that cover death as a topic, confront some of the issues about death, listen to podcasts about death. What is the specific prediction if my belief is true? And chances are Monica would say something like, I'll just be overwhelmed by emotions, I'll collapse, I'll not be able to cope, I will just be in this endless state of panic and not be able to deal with things. Then you get her to start experiencing it. You can do it in a graded way, or you can even throw them in the deep end. I always like to throw people in the deep end because my experience is they actually cope a lot better than they think they would, especially with this issue. Of course, with some exceptions where you do need to be careful. And the conclusions are, and the conclusion may be something to the effect of, I can think about death and cope with the emotions that it generates, or it's not unbearable, or talking about death doesn't increase the emotions, it can actually reduce it, or something to that extent. And in the second example, you've got Irene, who believes that she's never doing enough and constantly self-flagellating, constantly blaming herself, and constantly thinking that she's, very resistant to any sort of self-compassion exercises, because she sort of believes that, that will make her lazy and ineffective. And there's a bit of that perfectionism going on as well. So her belief is, if I do start thinking about myself as adequate, I'll become lazy, ineffective, and not get any work done. And the alternative perspective is, if I do think of myself as adequate, I will not be lazy and ineffective, and I'll continue to do as much work as before. So the experiment might involve something like 3 times a day, stop during the day, tell myself that I'm doing a good job. Or it might be practice self-compassion exercises, listen to self-compassion meditations, and relax into rather than resist the idea of self-compassion. There are all sorts of exercises that you can do to just break that, or at least test whether that habit is actually protective. And her specific predictions will be something to the effect of, I will lose my motivation, I'll stop working, I'll get very little done in a day. The result, my guess is, and my experience is, you can usually pick the experiments, and I'll talk about this in a moment, but the experience was, she changes her attitude, there's no difference. There's no measurable difference in the amount of work she gets done, but she feels a little bit more relaxed. And the conclusion, something to the effect of, recognising my achievements does not lead to a loss of productivity. I can practice self-compassion without becoming less effective in my work. So these are just examples of how these can be challenged. I want to just finish with that question that came up before, and that is, what if the experiment fails? And the big fear is, I'll get the client to do a behavioural experiment. What if they have a negative experience? Well, a couple of things that are important. You always plan experiments with low risk of failure. If you have a client that is severely introverted and has no friends and has very poor social skills, you don't get them to go and do a behavioural experiment where they need to initiate conversation with somebody in a party, because the chances are she's going to have a negative outcome. So they're usually, I would say very rarely, in my experience, do you have sort of really significant bad failures. Every now and again it doesn't work exactly as you plan, but in the end there's still the learning experience that they coped and nothing terrible happened. But usually you kind of know that, so if you're dealing with someone who has really obviously distorted irrational beliefs, and it's highly unlikely that their beliefs are going to be reinforced through a behavioural experiment, they're the ones that you can do very happily. You do need to stress, however, with the client, it is an experiment. There is no guaranteed result. And there was one experiment where I got a client to go to a social function, and she went on her own, and she did end up spending a fair bit of the time on her own. So it wasn't an ideal result, but in the end we talked about, in the end she still coped, and she was able to practice mindful acceptance, and it wasn't a terrible event. So always look for some learning, even if it's not exactly what you were hoping for. And sometimes just discussing the factors that might have influenced the result. So for example, with the woman who didn't feel comfortable at the social event, she still did tend to keep to herself, and we talked about how you could actually do it differently, so that you initiate contact with someone, you actually self-disclose and say, I find these sorts of social situations a bit difficult. We could redesign the experiment and start again. You have to remember that by nature it's an experiment, and with experiments you never have a guaranteed outcome, but the majority, if it's well designed, the majority tend to work well. And even on the odd occasion when they don't work exactly as you would hope, you can still learn something positive from it, and hopefully in some cases try again. Always look for the positive, even when the results are not what you'd hoped for. In other words, it happened, but I still coped, and it wasn't that terrible. Okay, I actually was hoping for question time, but I think we've pretty much run out of time. I have included the name of that, the reference, the Oxford Guide to Behavioural Experiments in Cognitive Therapy. It's in the chat box for anyone who's interested. And I'm going to hand back to Carmen.
Thank you, Sarah, and we will include that reference in the email that's coming out to you, along with all the forms, the 3 forms from Sarah, so that you have those as an ongoing resource. I'm also putting into the chat for you an evaluation link, and we would love to hear about what you thought of tonight's session and what you'd like from us, because we're really looking for ways to help you and support you at this time. So anything you can tell us, we'd be very happy to hear. Sarah, thank you so much for a really interesting session. It was so packed full, and I know we like to have questions at the end, but the information was so valuable. So really appreciate your time tonight and everything that you've contributed. And also to all of our participants, we had 98 people online tonight. Really outstanding turnout, and it's no surprise with Sarah as our speaker. But thank you all for coming in and participating, joining us. So,
and I just want to say, Carmen, if anyone wants more information and hasn't done the GAD training, most people find that really helpful. And we do we do more of the behavioural experiments and the theory 1, theory 2, and some of the things I've touched on today will be elaborated in the generalised anxiety program, and that's on Saturday.
That's this Saturday, the 5th of September. I will send you a link. If you're not already registered, we'll send you a link for that so that you can have a look, have a read of the outline and register if you want to. There's still time to do that. We'll also send you your special offers that come with the Thrive sessions, and look out for those. They'll all come out to you this evening. That's it from us, I think, Sarah.
Thank you, and thanks everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Sarah. Good night.
Thank you.